Lynn stood by the window of her bedroom, gazing at the gray sky beyond the glass. Snow was falling softly, as if covering the world from harshness and pain. She traced a finger along the fogged-up window, leaving a random line behind, a reflection of her own thoughts. The world seemed hazy, distant, almost like her own life. She was 39 and felt like a woman who once knew happiness, but had long lost that knowledge. Her home no longer echoed with laughter. Her husband, Edward, had become a ghost of their former love, dedicating all his energy to his career and occasional fragmented conversations about work. Their talks were like negotiations between two managers who simply needed to allocate responsibilities. Feelings were never discussed. Her son Nathan had changed too. Once a child who would cling to her at night, seeking comfort after nightmares, he was now growing up too fast. At 17, he was tall, reserved, always busy with something she couldn't understand. His voice sounded like a man's, but sometimes it still had the same intonations as when he was a child. These small moments made her heart ache, reminding her that time was relentless. Edward suggested a trip to their old family home. He said it casually, as if checking off a task from a list. "You both need to spend some time together," he said over his shoulder, not taking his eyes off his phone. "It'll do you good too. Fresh air, you'll relax." His words sounded like he was talking to a colleague, not his wife. Lynn wanted to object, to say that this wouldn't solve anything, that she needed something more than just a trip, but instead she just nodded. Maybe she was tired of trying to explain the deep loneliness that had settled within her. The days leading up to the trip passed quickly, but Lynn felt a strange tension in the air. Nathan was unusually quiet, almost detached. He quickly packed his things, tossing them into the trunk of the car. His movements were methodical, devoid of rush or enthusiasm. She noticed how grown up he had become when he carried heavy bags with an ease that seemed foreign to her. As the car pulled onto the road, the silence inside was almost deafening. Lynn tried to start a conversation, asking Nathan about school, friends, and hobbies. His answers were short, sometimes barely audible. "Are you looking forward to the trip?" she finally asked, trying to keep her voice light. "I guess," he replied, not taking his eyes off the road. The simplicity of his response cut deeper than she expected. "It's just the two of us," she thought, feeling a pang of sadness. When the familiar outlines of the house appeared on the horizon, Lynn was overcome with nostalgia. This place had once been their refuge. She remembered how Edward had laughed and lifted her up when they first arrived as newlyweds. These walls held warmth, laughter, and love. Now it all seemed like a distant fairy tale. The house greeted them with creaking stairs and the faint scent of pine logs that permeated the air. Lynn entered first, holding her breath as if afraid that her past would slip away if she breathed too deeply. "Remember how we used to play hide and seek here?" She tried to start a conversation with Nathan, but he just nodded, his face unreadable. When he started unloading the car, Lynn was left alone in the cold living room. Her eyes stopped at the old fireplace, where a cozy fire once burned. She walked over and ran her hand along the wooden frame, as if trying to bring back long-gone memories. That night, as darkness enveloped their little house, Lynn sat by the fireplace with a glass of wine. The fire cast soft shadows on the walls, creating an illusion of movement that had long been absent here. Nathan sat across from her, his face focused and adult-like. "You've grown so much," she said suddenly, feeling the words catch in her throat. He looked at her and smiled slightly. "I think so. And you? You don't look like most moms." The phrase caught her off guard. She laughed, but the laughter was forced. "What do you mean?" "You're different. You look younger," he said, and there was something in his eyes that she couldn't understand. Lynn set her glass aside and looked at the fire. She felt something shifting inside her, slowly but inevitably moving towards a boundary she never thought she would cross. The next morning, the house felt even colder than the night before. Lynn got up first and, wrapped in a blanket, walked around the room, lighting the fireplace. Her fingers trembled, but she blamed it on the cold, even though she knew the reason was deeper. Every corner of this house was filled with memories that seemed alive. They hid in the cracks on the floor, in the rustling of the wind outside, in the scent of the wooden walls that aged along with her marriage. When Nathan came downstairs, he found her standing by the window with a cup of coffee. "Good morning," she said, her voice softer than she expected. He nodded and headed to the kitchen, where he started rummaging through the cabinets looking for something to eat. "Nothing has changed, has it?" he said, reheating leftovers from the previous night's dinner in the microwave. "No, nothing," she agreed, even though she knew it wasn't true. Everything had changed, just not on the surface. After breakfast, they decided to take a walk. The path leading to the forest was just as she remembered. The snow crunched softly under their boots, and the air was so cold that their breath turned into clouds of steam. Lynn remembered how she and Edward used to walk here, holding hands, laughing, and planning their future. Now it felt like those memories belonged to someone else. "Do you think about the past often?" Nathan suddenly asked, interrupting her thoughts. She stopped and looked at him. There was something troubled in his eyes, as if he was searching for an answer to a question he was afraid to ask directly. "Sometimes," she answered evasively. "What about you?" He shrugged. "I think we all do." Lynn felt a coldness in her heart, but it wasn't from the weather. She wanted to ask what he meant, but instead, they continued walking. The forest was quiet, almost eerie. The branches of the trees bent under the weight of the snow, and the rare sounds of falling snow or bird calls seemed loud in this silence. Nathan walked ahead, his broad shoulders and confident stride reminding Lynn that her son was no longer a child. "Remember when we built a fort over there?" she suddenly said, pointing to a small clearing. Nathan turned around. "I remember. You even climbed inside to make sure the roof didn't leak." Lynn smiled. "I was braver back then." "You're still brum," he said softly, but with such certainty that she felt warmth in her chest. They returned to the house as the sun began to set, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. Lynn lit the fireplace while Nathan brought in firewood. She watched him as he entered the house, shaking the snow off his boots, his hair slightly sticking to his forehead from sweat. "You handle this better than I do," she said with a smile, watching his skillful movements. "You taught me, remember?" he replied, nodding towards the fireplace. They spent the evening in silence. Lynn tried to read a book but couldn't concentrate. Every time she looked up, she noticed Nathan watching her. His gaze was calm, but there was something hidden in it that she couldn't decipher. When night fell and they retreated to their rooms, Lynn lay in bed, looking at the rough wooden beams. Her head was spinning with their conversations. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the boundary between them was becoming thinner. The silence of the house was so deep that every sound seemed loud. Lynn could hear the floorboards creaking under Nathan's feet as he moved quietly around the house. There was a strange feeling, as if he wasn't just walking, but perhaps searching for something, maybe answers to his own questions. That night she dreamed of memories from the past, how she and Edward, still young, sat by this very fireplace, how he covered her with a blanket, how he whispered things to her that took her breath away. When she woke up, her heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed to fill the entire house. She couldn't fall back asleep. Instead, she got up and went to the window. Outside, there was only snow and darkness. But inside the house, something was slowly but inevitably changing her world. The next morning was bright and clear. Lynn woke up to the sunlight streaming through the frosted window, filling the room with cold light. She could hear Nathan already moving around the house, his steps echoing softly on the wooden floors. She got up, put on a warm sweater, and went downstairs where she found him at the kitchen table. "Good morning," she said, sitting down across from him. "Morning," he replied briefly, not looking up from the book he was holding. Lynn looked at him, studying his face. He looked focused, almost detached, but there was a strange light in his eyes that she couldn't explain. "What are you reading?" She tried to start a conversation. "Just something for school," he replied, closing the book and setting it aside. Lynn knew he didn't want to talk, but she couldn't leave the conversation at that. "You rarely read at home," she noted, smiling. He shrugged slightly. "It's easier to concentrate here. It's quiet." She nodded, feeling the silence between them fill with something unspoken, full of unvoiced thoughts and emotions. "How do you feel being here?" she finally asked. "Honestly, I don't know. It's strange. Strange. Too many memories, and they're not always pleasant," he said softly, looking out the window. Lynn felt her heart tighten. I understand. This place was different when you were little. Nathan turned to her, his gaze sharp and attentive. And for you? How was it for you? The question caught her off guard. She looked away, pretending to think about her answer. It was a place where I was happy once, she admitted. He continued to look at her, as if searching for something more in her words. And now? Lynn wanted to answer, but couldn't. She just shrugged. Now everything is different. During the day, they decided to take a walk to the lake, which was a few minutes away from the house. The sun was shining brightly and the snow sparkled under their feet. Lynn walked ahead, trying to distract herself from the thoughts that kept returning to their morning conversation. You think too much, Mom, Nathan suddenly said, catching up to her. She stopped and turned around. Is it that obvious? Very. Sometimes you look like you see something that isn't there. Lynn smiled, but the phrase struck her with its accuracy. And what about you? What do you think about when you look at me? He looked at her, his face serious. I think you demand too much of yourself. She was taken aback by his words. What do you mean? You always try to be perfect. For everyone. For Dad. For me. But you never ask yourself what you want. Lynn felt her breath become uneven. Her son was talking to her in a way no one had in a long time. And what if I don't know what I want anymore? She whispered, almost afraid to admit it. Then start small, he replied gently. Ask yourself what you want right now. She looked at him, and for a moment it felt like he saw right through her. I just want to be happy, she finally admitted. Nathan nodded, but his eyes revealed more than he said aloud. Then start with yourself. When they returned to the house, the sun was already setting. Lynn started preparing dinner, trying to focus on everyday tasks to distract herself from the conversation that still echoed in her mind. Nathan sat in the living room, tending to the fireplace. She watched him from the kitchen, noting how confidently he handled the firewood, how the firelight illuminated his face. It was strange to see him so grown up. Mom, come here, he suddenly said, not looking up from the fire. She walked over and sat down across from him. What is it? He paused for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. Have you ever thought about how things would be if everything had turned out differently? She frowned. What do you mean? If you and Dad were different, if we had a different life. Lynn looked down. Sometimes, she admitted, but I think you can't live only on memories or dreams of what could have been. He looked at her, and there was something in his gaze that made her heart skip a beat. And what if you could change something now? Would you do it? Lynn felt a tension building inside her. She didn't know how to answer, but she understood that this conversation was opening something new between them. I don't know, Nathan. Maybe it depends on what needs to be changed. His eyes gleamed in the firelight, and he nodded as if satisfied with her answer. They sat in silence as the flames began to die down, leaving only a soft, warm light in the room. At that moment, Lynn realized that these weekends were truly changing something in their relationship, although she didn't yet know where it would lead. That evening started like any other. The crackling of the fire, the soft light from the lamp, and the silence interrupted by occasional remarks. Lynn felt strangely relaxed despite the inner turmoil. Nathan sat on the couch, absently flipping through the pages of his book, but Lynn noticed how his gaze kept returning to her. It wasn't intrusive, but it was enough to make her feel a slight tension. She stood up, rubbing her stiff neck, which had been aching since the morning. After the walk and a full day on her feet, her muscles ached more than usual. Is everything okay? Nathan asked, noticing her movement. Yes, just a little tired, she replied, though her voice betrayed otherwise. He put down his book and stood up. Let me help. You always complain that no one helps you. Lynn smiled, trying to ease the awkwardness. Well, usually no one offers. Then I'll be the first, he said with a warm smile that, for a moment, took her back to the past when he was a little boy, ready to help with everything. She sat down on the old leather couch, and he stood behind her. Lynn felt his hands gently touch her shoulders. At first she tensed, not expecting such a gesture, but then she allowed herself to relax. His touches were confident and precise, as if he knew what he was doing. You're always so tense, he noted, massaging her muscles. It's age, she joked. It's fatigue, he countered. His hands moved slowly and methodically, relieving the tension from each knot. Lynn closed her eyes, allowing herself to enjoy the moment. She couldn't remember the last time someone had taken such good care of her. It was a strange but pleasant contrast to her husband's coldness. "Remember when you used to ask me to massage your shoulders when you were little?" she asked, trying to break the suddenly thick silence. "Of course. You always laughed when I did it wrong." "You were so little back then," she said with a warm smile. "And now I'm big," he said softly, his voice unexpectedly serious. Lynn paused for a moment, not knowing what to say. The room fell silent again, interrupted only by the crackling of the firewood in the fireplace. His touches became a little more confident, and she felt something intangible but palpable growing between them. She straightened up to ease the tension and turned to face him. "Thank you. I feel better now," she said, trying to keep her voice light. Nathan nodded, but there was something in his eyes that made her hold his gaze. He was no longer the little boy she knew, but someone else, an adult, strong and complex. She looked away first, feeling her heart beat a little faster. "Mom?" he began, but then paused as if struggling with his thoughts. "What is it?" she asked softly, though she felt a tightness inside. "Are you happy?" His question was so unexpected that she didn't know how to respond at first. She froze, trying to gather her words. "I don't know. I don't think so." "And you?" He smiled, but it was a sad smile. "I think we both pretend too much that everything is okay." Her eyes filled with tears, and she quickly looked away so he wouldn't notice. Her son saw through her, knew her pain, and understood what she herself was afraid to admit. "You're too smart for your age," she said, trying to make her voice firm. "I just pay too much attention," he replied softly. They spent the rest of the evening in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Nathan went to bed earlier, but Lynn stayed by the fireplace, feeling torn by her conflicting emotions. She thought about what she had said to him and what she hadn't dared to say, about the boundary that was beginning to blur, but which she was afraid to cross. When she finally went to bed, the house was filled with a deep silence. But this silence was different, thick, filled with something invisible yet tangible. That night she couldn't fall asleep for a long time. She lay awake, listening to the silence which only amplified her anxiety. She closed her eyes trying to fall asleep, but her thoughts buzzed like a swarm of bees in her head. "Are you happy?" Nathan's words echoed in her mind, impossible to silence. Her son saw her so clearly, so accurately, that it scared her. She was used to hiding her feelings, from her husband, from her friends, even from herself. But Nathan was like a reflection of her own pain, and she couldn't look at him for too long, afraid of seeing what she wasn't ready to admit. She turned onto her side, pulling the blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes. But sleep wouldn't come. Her heart was beating too loudly, as if resisting the calm she so desperately sought. After some time, she heard another sound, footsteps. They were soft, almost inaudible. But in this house, she knew every creak of the floorboards like her own breath. The steps were coming closer until they stopped at her door. Lynn held her breath. "Mom?" Nathan's voice was soft, almost a whisper. She wanted to pretend to be asleep, but something made her respond. "Yes? Are you awake?" "Yes," she admitted. "What's wrong?" "I just wanted to check if everything is okay," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "Everything is fine," she replied softly, though her heart was beating faster. There was a moment of silence. Then she heard him take a step forward. "Can I come in?" Lynn hesitated but then nodded, even though he couldn't see her in the darkness. "Of course." The door opened quietly and his silhouette appeared in the soft moonlight, filtering through the window. He entered the room, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at her. "You look tired," he said, his voice filled with care. "I just can't fall asleep," she replied, trying to sound calm. He was silent for a few seconds before speaking again. "You think too much." Lynn smiled. "You've said that already today." "Because it's true." He leaned forward, his gaze focused. "You worry too much about what others think." "Isn't that natural?" she asked, her voice slightly trembling. "Maybe, but sometimes you need to think about yourself." His voice was gentle but firm. He reached out to cover her shoulder with the blanket, and his hand lingered for a moment. Lynn felt her heart skip a beat. It was a gesture of care, but there was something more in it, something she couldn't understand, or perhaps was afraid to understand. "You've always been the most important person to me," he said suddenly, his voice a little softer. Her eyes widened and she looked at him. There was something in his gaze that made her feel both warmth and unease. "Nathan," she began, but she didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," he stepped back, standing up from the bed. "I didn't mean to bother you. I just wanted to make sure you're okay." She wanted to stop him, to say that everything was fine, but the words stuck in her throat. He turned to the door and paused, looking back. "If you need anything, I'm always here." Lynn nodded silently, watching as he left the room and closed the door behind him. The next morning was tense. Lynn woke up with a sense of anxiety that hadn't left her all night. Nathan was already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. She entered, pretending that nothing had happened. "Good morning," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "Morning," he replied briefly, not looking up from the eggs he was frying in the pan. They ate in silence. Lynn felt the tension hanging in the air, but she didn't know how to break it. She tried to think of something that could distract them both. "What are your plans for today?" she finally asked. "Nothing special. Maybe I'll go for a walk," he replied. "Okay, I'll probably do some cleaning." "You always find something to do to distract yourself," he noted, looking at her. She met his gaze, seeing something in his eyes that made her catch her breath. "That's not true," she objected, though her voice sounded uncertain. "It is." He leaned in slightly. "You never stop to think about what you need." She felt her cheeks flush. "I'm just trying to be useful." "But to whom?" His question was direct, and she didn't know how to answer. There was a moment of silence between them. Then Nathan stood up, put his plate in the sink, and turned to her. "Mom, you deserve more." Those words pierced her heart, leaving her sitting in complete silence as he left the kitchen. The day dragged on painfully slowly. Lynn tried to focus on her usual chores, cleaning the house, packing things, preparing lunch. But her thoughts kept returning to the events of the previous night and their morning conversation. She felt strangely detached, as if she were watching her own life from the outside. Nathan spent most of the day outside walking around the area. His absence was both a relief and a source of anxiety. Lynn tried to convince herself that it was all just her imagination, a play of her mind caused by loneliness and tension. By evening, it had gotten colder, and the snow began to fall in thick flakes. Lynn lit the fireplace and made hot chocolate. When Nathan returned, his face was flushed from the cold, and a thin layer of snow covered his shoulders. "You were out for a long time," she said, placing a cup in front of him. "I just needed some time to think," he replied, nodding in thanks. They sat by the fireplace, each lost in their thoughts. Lynn felt something intangible yet palpable hanging between them, like a storm ready to break at any moment. "We're leaving tomorrow," she said finally, trying to break the silence. Nathan nodded but said nothing. "Are you looking forward to going home?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. He looked at her with that same seriousness that always left her at a loss. "Are you?" Lynn looked down. "I think so, though I don't know." "You don't want to go home," he said with certainty, as if reading her thoughts. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his gaze. "I know," she admitted softly. "Then why go back?" Her heart tightened. She knew the answer to that question was much more complicated than he could understand. "Because I have to," she replied, trying to sound confident. He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "You always do what you have to, not what you want." "Nathan," her voice trembled, "I'm your mother. I have to think about others." "And who thinks about you?" he asked, his words hitting her like a knife, straight to the core of her pain. She stood up, feeling like she couldn't bear his gaze any longer. "Stop," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't continue this conversation." "Why? Because I'm telling the truth." His voice was firm but not aggressive. She turned to face him, her eyes filled with tears. "Because I don't know how to answer," she admitted. They stood facing each other, the fireplace between them, its light casting long shadows on the walls. It was a moment where everything depended on their words, but Lynn didn't know what to say. "Mom," he began, but she raised her hand, stopping him. "Nathan, please. We need to go back to what's right, to what's safe." Her voice was soft, almost pleading. He didn't move, but in his eyes she saw understanding. He knew her words came from fear, not certainty. "Okay," he said finally, taking a step back. "But I want you to know, you deserve more." The next morning they packed their things in silence. Nathan drove the car while Lynn watched the snowy landscapes pass by. She felt the weight of the past slowly returning to its familiar places, but now it felt heavier than before. When they arrived home, Edward was already waiting for them. His greeting was warm, but superficial, as always. He kissed Lynn on the cheek, asked Nathan about the trip, and then went about his business. Lynn stood in the hallway, feeling the emptiness of the house envelop her once again. She turned to Nathan, who stood still, his gaze fixed on her. "Thank you for this weekend," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. He nodded. "I hope you remember what I said." Lynn smiled, but her smile was sad. "I will." When he went to his room, Lynn was left alone in the silence of the house. She knew that nothing had changed, and yet something inside her would never be the same again.